Hello again, everybody. I think tonight we've had to my mind actually, 4 great speeches. The very, very highest standard of speech that I think we see in this series of debates. I hope my regulars agree with that. So I'd like another round of applause, please, for the 4 speakers. And a thank you, of course, to Richard, who now comes into his own. Yes, with the question and answers. Has anybody got any more questions or postcards, please? Have they all been collected around the room? We have a huge number already. Okay. So I'm going to hand over the next one out. So the next part of the motion to Richard. I think the speakers then summarise and then we'll take a vote. I don't know whether there's anybody out there watching this, but hello, everybody.
Yes, please.
Right, thank you very much for the questions you put in. Some of these are absolutely brilliant, and I'm sure will tax the ingenuity of our speakers, and we'll go on to those in a second. There are some that I haven't selected because they're not directly related to the motion tonight. It will be, I think, appropriate for other debates, so please come to the debate next Monday or the one after that, or the final one in the week of the referendum itself. So we're dealing with the democracy and the corruption issue tonight, and not wider issues about EU membership. The first question is, it says it's for the supporters of the motion, but I'll obviously give an opponent the opportunity to reply as well. Can you give specific examples of laws dictated by the EU that have had a negative impact on Britain? David?
Well, there's lots I can give you. Now I'm back in business. I'm on the receiving end of these things. I mentioned one that affects me as a chairman of a building company, the mortgage directive. As I said, we don't grant mortgages, but we're still caught. So the costs that we have to bear, it's all passed on to people who buy our houses. People say, houses are too expensive in this country. I agree. And this is one of the reasons, just unnecessary red tape. But the point is, there was nothing we could do about it, because it was an EU law promulgated at the top level, and although the British government argued against this aspect of it, we were overruled, and that's not democratic. But not be too self-serving and talk about my own business, I will mention another business, which is the art market. We have the largest art market in Europe, in London, and some time ago, under the last Labour government, the French and German proposed a resale levy, or in French it's called the droit de suite, which means that when a work is sold, a proportion is taken and given to the artist, original artist, or the estate if he's dead or she's dead. Now this was opposed by the British Art Market Federation, which understood quite rightly that if there's a Picasso painting or a great Matisse, it won't be sold in London if this levy increases the price which the seller has to pay. In other words, it'll be sold more likely in New York or Zurich or Monaco or Tokyo. It's a totally global market. And an impressive array of artists, including David Hockney, I remember, also opposed this new regulation. And to be fair to Tony Blair, and I don't like being fair to Tony Blair, but I'm going to be here, his government opposed it. They realised that the dominance and position of the London art market was going to be undermined by a resale levy which is applied to art only sold in Europe, not in the rest of the world. He tried his best, to be fair, he did. And of course the other parties, I don't know about the Liberal Democrats, but certainly the Conservative Party, and the House of Commons generally, we passed a motion to have Parliament, government, the art market in London, artists in London, all against it. What happened? It was imposed on us by majority voting. That is a specific and live example of a British strength being undermined by an undemocratic legal system.
Where will you stand on the teeth? I'd be interested to know
know on that one what actually happened to the art market, because I don't think it really affected the art market that badly, did it? My impression was that it didn't. But a lot of people talk about legislation that impact on this country that is imposed on us. But as I explained, it's not imposed on us. The council ministers and parliamentarians agree it. But a lot of people don't like legislation on the environment, for instance. They say that they've got to pay too much money because of environmental legislation. I happen to think environmental legislation is good, because the environment doesn't respect borders, it goes across borders, so I think environmental legislation is good. But people do argue. People do argue, and I've heard it during this campaign, oh, all these environmental pieces of legislation we have to adhere to. The other thing on various things like health and safety, a lot of people, and workers' rights in particular, a lot of people would like to oppose workers' rights, to get rid of workers' rights completely. I would think the other side of the argument would actually say a lot of these are totally unnecessary. I happen to think on something I worked on, like the asbestos directive, it was important that some of our construction workers who are going to work in Germany should be protected in the same way as they're protected in this country. I happen to think the European Union do a good job on trying to protect workers' rights. So I could go on for a long time about a lot of the different pieces of legislation. Yes, we did get some wrong. But so does this government get some things wrong. Nothing is absolutely perfect, I'm not saying that. But on average, I think the legislation that is passed is protecting people in this country rather than damaging them.
The next question is about auditing. Questioner says this: in 2006, John Bourne of the National Audit Office told the European Union Select Committee that if he had to audit the UK accounts, as the European Court of Auditors does, he would be unable to do it. Question is does this mean that the UK is corrupt?
David, for example, has worked in the Treasury, and I can remember some years ago someone called Linda Chalker, some of you will remember her. She was a development minister, and I set up, as one of my activities in the European Parliament, the largest pro-democracy and human rights programs in the world. It spends 160 million euros a year, operates worldwide, and it's the only EU program that can operate without host country consent. So it's a very fine program. It funds all the EU monitoring missions for elections around the world, among other things. Linda said to me that the reason that the EU had such difficulties was that it was so picky about its audit process. And I believe that is the case. It's actually even worse than it used to be under the new financial regulation. And while I believe it's important to have that standard, it does create certain difficulties, as for example, not signing off the accounts for certain periods has been a problem politically for the European Union. But it's not them, it's also us. For example, Yorkshire and the Humber, because the accounts are audited on a regional basis in Brussels, that's money going to regions in this country. Yorkshire and the Humber for several years had their accounts not signed off for various reasons. That also applies to countries within the European Union, dare I say, more club-med countries than the northern ones. But we're getting everybody up to the same standard. So while, of course, I wouldn't argue that the British administrations were corrupt, I think this is the least corrupt country in the world, actually. But this can be contended by those like the Italian quoted in today's Times, who said it's the most corrupt in terms of its easygoing attitude towards taxation, tax havens, etc., etc. So there are things that the MPs and the House of Lords have to do. But I'm satisfied that the external audits done while I was chairman of the European Parliament's audit panel by Coopers & Lybrand, an international firm now, were done to the highest possible standard, and they gave our internal accounts a clean sign-off. And I think we can be confident that although people think back to the old days of corruption in Europe, it is no longer the case, and I think it's important that the electorate in this country realise that when people talk about corruption in the EU, that is a thing largely of the past.
I'm going to answer that one because I'm an accountant by profession. I'm one of those sad people who actually reads audit reports, and I'm afraid it's not true that the latest report of the European Court of Auditors gave it a clean bill of health. I've actually luckily brought along that exact phrase. They say that the accounts for the year to December 2014 are affected by material error. Now that means that their accounts have been qualified. If the company of which I'm a chairman had its account qualified in that way, I might get away with it for 1 year. The second year, I would certainly sack the finance director. And the third year, its shareholders would get rid of us, quite rightly too. It's been going on in the European Union for 21 years. And there's nothing ever gets done. And I so well remember that first meeting when I attended as a junior Treasury Minister. I was told, yes, okay, it's all going to get better. Yes, I know, next year we've got people working on it. We've got a fraud office, an anti-fraud office. Okay, the second year, still bad. I said, this is intolerable. Come on, go on forgiving them. 21 years? As I say, if that was a public company, it would have gone bust. They'd all be. I'm now a treasurer, trustee of the National Lottery Board, and if our accounts, which are audited every year by the National Audit Office in this country, were qualified in that way, in other words, if they were affected by material errors, the trustee would have to resign. There's no doubt about that. It would be intolerable. But the point is, whether it's right or it's wrong, there's nothing that you as taxpayers can do about it. It's your money. It's not their money. You pay it. You pay it to the British government, that pays it to the European Commission, that pays it to the European government. £9 billion net goes over there. And once it goes over to the Brussels bank account, there's nothing whatsoever that we can do about it. That is wrong. That is undemocratic. It is intolerable. But it goes on for 21 years.
Just a very brief thing that if you look at information, if you look at the Court of Auditors report, which you can look up online, page 8 of the report actually said it has been signed off. Yes, it's right that they talked about irregularities, but no different from the irregularities in a lot of reports. But the Court of Auditors have signed it off, page 8 of the report, if you look it up online, for the last 7 years.
Thanks. The next question is as follows. MEPs cannot propose legislation despite being the only directly elected EU officials. Is this democratic?
I've always thought that it was completely undemocratic, the fact that an appointed body such as the European Commission could actually bring forth legislation. If you know how people are appointed, of course, to the European Commission, they're made commissioners when they basically failed in the politics of their own country. So when Neil Kinnock lost the election, as a consolation prize, they sent him off to Europe as a commissioner. And because that is a completely appointed body, it is not democratic, and it has the right to initiate legislation. And I think that's completely wrong.
Oh, okay, thank you. I assume that was the last point, not
Turn your mic on!
Oh, that's a good idea. Now, it came on. Yeah, thank you. Yes, you say that parliamentarians are not allowed to propose legislation. You're right to a certain extent, but we do have own initiative reports now, so that parliamentarians can propose legislation. We've also got a citizens' initiative. It's not used as much as it could be, which would be a very good idea if it was, but you can a citizens' initiative can actually propose legislation, but parliamentarians can to own initiative reports. But the Commission are appointed, as was said, by the governments of different countries. So it's up to the governments to decide who goes forward to be their commissioner. And surely governments are not going to put forward somebody that they don't think can do the job on their behalf. And the Commission, once they're appointed, have to work in the interest of the European Union, as well as having been appointed from their own country. But yes, the Commission do propose most of the legislation, but they do not have the power to actually legislate. And that is the key point, as I said in my original remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, just to demonstrate how impartial and objective I am, I'm going to put the next question which I thought a bit about before I got to my feet, and it's as follows. Is it not hypocritical to describe the EU with its elected parliament as undemocratic when the British House of Lords is entirely unelected?
I'll start on this one. Look, in a perfect world, the two houses in Westminster will both be elected under a system which is fair and proportionate. And unfortunately, the Liberal Democrats in the coalition were unable to push this forward to any extent, apart from the referendum on that misbegotten form of proportional representation, the alternative vote. The House of Lords can speak for itself, but we do need a revising chamber. I think it's an appropriate system for this country. Many countries around the world have two chambers, and the one being the primary chamber directly elected in most cases. Sometimes, like in Ireland, you have a Senate which is appointed on the basis of a particular experience or the sectoral interest, the agriculturalists, the scientists, and so on. There are many different ways of doing it. I would defend that system, but I would certainly hope to see within my lifetime a fully elected House of Lords, and a slightly smaller one too. Now, I have every respect for the two members of the House here this evening.
The fact is that if you elect the House of Lords, as you do the Commons, the political, it doesn't matter which system you use, if you have the same system in both houses, you get the same result in both houses.
Nonsense.
So, all right then. So then you're saying that this election for the Lords is going to happen on a different day for the Commons, is it?
No, what I'm saying is that whether it be the Senate in Ireland or the Lords here, they can block legislation, and that's what's so important in our society. We need an upper chamber that can prevent things, so what you're saying is rubbish.
And they can, and that could be an upper chamber of elected.
I thought we were talking about the fact that the House of Lords was unelected.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
fine.
if you make the
I-
House of Lords elected, how do you stop it completely replicating the House of Commons?
What I'm saying is, I don't want to
Use a
see.
different voting system.
I don't want to see.
No, no, hold on.
We could do what they do in America and elect a third every 4 years.
So you'd have the House of Lords elected at a different period to the House of Commons.
Absolutely.
So therefore it had a different composition.
Yeah.
So therefore...
Works in America, doesn't it?
Okay, fine. I never quite understand why people compare the presidential system of the United
Not the
States.
presidential system, the Senate. The
No,
Senate is elected.
America, if you notice, has a president. We don't have a president. We
Yeah.
have a prime minister who comes from the House of Commons.
The
So
Senate in
we have
Ireland.
a parliamentary system, they have a presidential system. So it's a completely different system, you can't compare the two. If you're going to, so supposing you elect the House of Commons one year, and theirs is a majority of Conservatives, and they form the government, and then you elect the Lords 2 years later, and they have a Labour majority, then that Labour majority will stop the Commons majority doing anything. They'll stop everything with the powers that they have today. So therefore, it is safer just to have a house that doesn't challenge the authority of the House of
No, but you need it. You
Commons.
need to challenge.
And there's a point
Let the speaker speak.
Now, maybe it was a mistake to have this question because this evening is not about the future of House of Lords. If Ted wants to invite me back to have that debate, I will take part in it, and I won't share it.
We'll take you up on that, Richard. And we'll bring a few more Lords up as well to debate it. but we will have that debate. We are intending, after these debates, and what I want to do, yes, is set up a Worcester Debating Society here at the pub. Yeah, there's a lot of interest out there in terms of politics. Shut up, everybody. I want to set up a Worcester Debating Society where we do have invited speakers. I can't do it all on my own. Yes, if you want to talk to me separately about that, I need a small committee around me where we can actually help to make that happen. So talk to me later. We're hoping to do it every fortnight. Yes, following from on from these debates, and we'll certainly cover that topic.
Thank you, Ted. Right. Another question. How much primary legislation passed by Westminster since 2010 was conditioned by European legislation?
This is one of the most hotly argued topics, and I don't know whether some of you may have seen that highly biased programme by Jeremy Paxman called Paxman in Brussels, which was very closely followed by a thing called the Brexit the Movie, which had almost identical content, the same graphics and everything else. But one of the points raised in both was exactly this issue, and it's anywhere between 15 and 60% of legislation originates in Brussels and ends up in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, or by an order in council. There are different ways they do it in Westminster. But the question is the scale and the importance of those bits of legislation. So by using a percentage is not really the answer. Is it something which is so fundamental that it requires particular attention? And of course, there are those bits of legislation which the House of Commons doesn't like, the House of Lords doesn't like. But in the end, the quality of the legislation coming from Brussels is the result of an enormous committee procedure. It may be dull, but it is fair. And as Liz has said earlier, the whole process of evolving legislation at the European level, getting 28 countries to agree, their parliaments, their MEPs, is quite an important process that we should actually be quite proud of in Europe. It is the first time in the history of the world there's been an international democracy. Believe me, it does work.
It's not an easy question to answer about the percentage, because the European Union legislates in a number of ways. It can pass directives, which then have to be transposed by the House of Commons into British law. But also, the EU can pass regulations which are directly applicable without any parliamentary sanction. And the proportion, therefore, of our total legal instruments under which we have to live is, according to one group called Open Europe, which is incidentally not a Brexit organisation, they say that 64.7% of all our legal instruments originate in Brussels. That is their figure, not mine. And certainly when I was on the European Scrutiny Committee as a member of the House of Commons, we felt completely powerless, because we had well over 1,000 a year of regulations and directives which we had to sort through and comment on. But in no case could we say no, because I remind you that EU law is formally superior to British law. So even if we said no and had the House of Commons behind us, and on occasion we did ask for a full debate on the floor of the House, and even if the House of Commons agreed with our comments that this was a regulation that we didn't want, there's nothing we could do about it. Now, for a so-called sovereign parliament that people have fought and died to create, representatives from you can kick us out if you don't like us, you can vote one way or the other. But there's nothing you can do about those over 1,000 regulations a year. They're coming your way and you can't dodge them.
There's a question here which I'm going to put as a supplementary to that first one, where Tim makes the point that much of the legislation is about the single market and would still apply if we wanted access to the single market if we left them. and therefore would it not be the case that we would have no opportunity to influence that? Liz, do you want that?
Yes, I mean, it's quite right. I don't know what the Brexiters want or the Leave campaign wants, because sometimes they say they want to be part of the single market still, other times they say they don't want to be part of the single market, so it's quite difficult. If we stay part of the single market, it's absolutely right. We'd have to adhere to all the legislation if we wanted to trade with the rest of the EU, and we'd have freedom of movement of workers as well. That's because if you stay in the single market, you have to do that. If, on the other hand, they want to get out of the single market, then, of course, that's going to affect our trade. But that's not really about the debate for tonight. Perhaps that's come up again in the future. But also, it's quite interesting that a lot of the legislation is such minor legislation. Yes, it might be 60%, but tiny little regulations going through it. It's not major things. And what's been happening in the European Union recently, in the last few years, and I think this is what I get fed up with, that so many of the people on the Leave side are 20, 25 years out of date. They don't seem to have taken into account all the different treaties that have happened. And also, with the European Commission President Barroso, when he was around, he wanted to streamline legislation, get rid of legislation if he felt it was not applicable, and that's what the parliamentarians were asking him to do. And so legislation has been streamlined. Some of the legislation has been repealed. And I think we've got to carry on doing that. I'd like to see sunset clauses in all legislation. In other words, any legislation comes through. If it hasn't worked within 5 years, then that legislation is withdrawn. And there's a movement afoot to actually do that. And I think that is very important, that we look at what has been happening over the last few years and not look at what the EU was like 20, 25 years ago.
I'm always very interested to hear about all these wonderful rules that the EU has brought in. When the EU finds that a rule is inconvenient, it breaks it. There was a very sensible rule brought in when they set up the Eurozone, which was called the Stability and Growth Pact. That meant, in fact, that there were limits on how much deficit you could run up in your finances of individual countries and what your overall debt levels came to. Well, the first people to break the Stability and Growth Pact in the Eurozone were the Germans, closely followed by the French. So I don't think we need really to be too concerned. If you take Norway, for instance, it's quite interesting that Norway are part of the single market, and they've had 19,000 instructions sent to them by the EU, of which they've actually put into legislation 5,000. So Norway doesn't seem to be totally held by the rules of being in the single market. And anyway, we are the 5th biggest economy in the world. And I don't see any reason whatsoever why we shouldn't have our own free trade treaty with the European Union. The European Union sells much more to us than we do to them, and therefore that they have every incentive of drawing up a free trade treaty with the United Kingdom if we come to leave.
The next question is as follows. If the EU is so democratic, why did Ireland have 2 referendums on the Lisbon Treaty until it delivered the right result?
I'm going to be careful here, but I think there are 1 or 2 Irish people in the pub.
Well, there's only Barry.
I'm not saying a word.
One of my Irish colleagues once said to me about Irish referendums that they're never about the question on the ballot paper, but they're always about sex and religion.
We want more of both.
So there you are. No, I think I'm going to leave this one now. The point about this is that the Irish were given a choice twice because the treaty was changed. And it was changed in a way to adapt to the interests of the Irish in particular respects. I can't remember exactly what they were. The same was done for Denmark. And the treaty was then put to them again. So this is part of a process of evolutionary democracy, let's call it that.
Yeah, it's fair.
Actually, it's slightly worse than the questioner says, because it's happened on 4 separate occasions, and I actually happen to have the dates with me. In 1992, Denmark rejected the Maastricht Treaty, but they were made to vote again the next year, so they passed it. Ireland rejected the Nice Treaty in 2001, but that wasn't good enough. They were made to try again, so they voted again. And then, perhaps most serious of all, in 2005, the European institutions proposed a European constitution. This was then went to referendums in France and 2 founder member countries, and they both voted overwhelmingly against the European constitution. But what happened? They changed the name of the constitution to the Lisbon Treaty, and it was enacted 3 years later. What happened to that, as we've just heard, is that Ireland voted against that Lisbon Treaty, but again, it went through anyway. You see, it's all one-sided. If people vote yes to more Europe, oh, that's a ringing endorsement of the entire project. If they vote no, oh, well, you don't really mean that. That's only an interim view. You don't really mean that. Have another vote. It's totally anti-democratic.
Next question. Next question. Is it not the case that Britain has a strong voice? For instance, we have the ability to veto new members, such as Turkey joining the EU, and is it not also the case that if 55% of national parliaments within the EU object to a piece of legislation, then it will be rethought? Yep.
Yes, that's absolutely right, and I think it's been disgraceful over the last few weeks how everybody on the Remain, or a lot of people, not everyone, there's some people who are not saying it, but a lot of people are saying that if we stay within the EU, Turkey will come in. And they've been questioned about it, on television, and I've got increasingly annoyed that some of the journalists haven't pushed the politicians, Boris Johnson or the others, because we do have a veto. Every single member state has a veto. And if we don't want Turkey to come in, we can veto it. And I personally don't think Turkey will actually meet the conditions. There is no way they will meet the conditions on human rights. They're going backwards. So for people to say and have this scare tactics, just because they've lost the vote, the public view on the economy, they've now got the scare tactics of saying Turkey is going to come in. You've got well, there's 75 million people coming in. Absolute rubbish. And I think people are really telling lies now. And I think that is the problem. Before it was stretching the truth, and now they're telling lies. Lies that can be proved to be lies, because we know there is a veto for every single member state. And I don't mind people giving their opinion, but when they come out and blatantly lie, and it can be proved to be a lie, I think that is wrong and is misleading the public.
Well, I'm very interested to hear David Cameron reminding us all that we got a veto on the admission of Turkey into the EU. Only 2 years ago, he was saying that Turkey would be very welcome in the EU.
Along with
So did Boris and ODS.
Well, successive governments have said that they want Turkey in the EU. British governments under different parties, they've been saying it for years that Turkey should be part of the EU. But let's look at Turkey under Erdogan. Why are we even talking about Turkey being a member of the EU now? It's because of the immigrants. And they are now holding some of these immigrants back in Turkey. But Erdogan has now seen the opportunity to get into the EU. And he's making it quite clear to anybody who listens or even reads a newspaper that if he doesn't get accession into the EU, the immigrants will start coming again. He is in a very strong position, and don't rule out entry of Turkey into the EU by any means whatsoever.
The
The fact is, let me just say, having spent 30 years in the European Parliament, 10 of which I was the spokesman on Turkey-EU relations, at a time when I thought it was valid for Turkey to come into the then EU for strategic reasons, as, for example, in the past Greece had been brought in for strategic reasons. But in recent years, and basically this began in France under President Chirac, a really strong reaction against Turkey as it became increasingly autocratic, anti-democratic, and as Liz has said, with deplorable human rights. The other day I read the European Parliament's April resolution on Turkey's accession. There is no way Turkey is going to come into the EU from an EU standpoint. It will have to spend a lot of time improving itself, and I don't expect to see it in my lifetime. And I don't actually want it. Turkey is not, to my mind, a European country. It doesn't have a European culture. And there are reasons in the past why we felt Turkey should be in, and there are reasons why we need to work with Turkey today, but it is not a fit country to be in the European Union. And I don't believe it will come in within my lifetime.
Slightly different subject now. The questioner says this: the EU legislative system and process seem too cumbersome to be really practical. What we have had in Westminster for a very long time may not be perfect, but it works for us. Do we want to lose it?
Yes, all democracies are imperfect. All governments make mistakes. The crucial thing is when they make a mistake, they've got to correct it. They've got to get rid of what's gone wrong and put something in its place. The trouble with the European Union is it never retreats. In the House of Commons, if you don't like the people there, you can get rid of them. You know the MP, you can chuck them out, you can get another lot in. That's what happens at a general election. But increasingly, the promises they make at general elections are completely hollow. We mentioned immigration. All political parties campaigned at the last election to control immigration. How can they do that when it's the EU that freedom of movement, which allows 500 million people, gives them a right to come here immediately? So our national democracy is not a choice between two competing or three competing, four parties offering different things, and you make the choice. Because they're promising things which they do not have the power to deliver. Because the power has gone upwards to the European Union, to an opaque decision-making and law-making system that you can not influence. They talked about the European Parliament. Actually, the other side of the lawmaking is in the Council of Ministers. They have to agree. That all takes place in secret. Nobody knows what goes on there. I know. I used to do it. I think it was, and I always used to say, why did you bring the television cameras in? Oh no, we can't. That's a very populist idea, they would say. It's outrageous. It's your money and it's your democracy. And it's being hollowed out. The powers that ought to reside in elected representatives that you control has gone upwards to an unaccountable European elite that never says no. And if you want an example, my final example is the euro. It is an absolute disgrace that their prime project, the euro, has laid waste the whole of southern Europe. And as Archie Hamilton told you, the unemployment amongst young people has reached 50%. Anyone with a scintilla of social conscience ought to be embarrassed. But those people in Brussels, oh no, they say, well, it's not too bad, we're going to get there. It's not their jobs at stake, it's not their pensions. They pay 15% income tax maximum in Brussels. No, the people that I feel sorry for are the working people of Greece, Portugal, Spain and southern Europe. They are suffering from an imposition of a single currency they never voted for and which they can do nothing about. It's an absolute scandal and I want nothing to do with it.
Yes, thank you. I think the question was something about, is the European... Can you read out the question again? Because I think we lost track of it.
Way off track.
question is, the EU legislative system and process seems too cumbersome to be really helpful. What we've had in Westminster for a very long time may not be perfect, but it works for us.
Yes, well, we're not getting rid of the Westminster system. The Westminster system works in tandem with the European Union. I explained the way we operated and how the European parliamentarians and the ministers actually decided on legislation. Yes, it is a long process. But I think because it's a long process, it's a democratic process. We go through all the different committee stages and the Parliament vote and the Council Ministers make their decision, and as I said, they come together, the parliamentarians and the Council Ministers, and decide on legislation. That is the way they do it. In Westminster, it is quite cumbersome as well. You go through the whole bill committees, which people don't really know what actually happens. When it goes onto a bill committee, you have to table amendments as well. I think if legislation in any legislature is cumbersome, then that is good, because it means you're scrutinising it. You're not just passing it on a whim, because if we did that, then I think it would be wrong. But we can, as I said before, repeal some of that legislation. Some of that legislation is being repealed in the European Union.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask a supplementary question to Mr. Heathcote-Amory about the euro? Is this on democracy?
No, we're not debating Europe.
No, it's a democratic question.
Go on,
I just want to ask, did not democratic governments in Italy, Spain, Portugal, etc. choose to join the euro?
Oh, they're all in the racket. Oh yes, yeah. Of course. When it went wrong, the EU imposed a technocratic government to try and make it work, and they failed. And you see, it's not the official class in Europe that suffer. Oh no, they're all fine. Not one single Eurocrat has ever lost his job over the failures of the euro. No, it's the ordinary people of Southern Europe that have suffered. And I think that there ought to be an apology from Brussels. This was, after all, their prime project. This, they said, would unify Europe. This was a Le Grand Project. This was a summit of their ambition. And they don't have any referendums. The only referendum they had on the euro was in Sweden. And what did they do there? The people voted against it. So Sweden's not a member of the euro. They were never asked in Greece. They were never asked in Portugal. They were never asked in Spain. No. Don't ask the people. They might say no. Of course, if they had voted no, they'd been made to try again the next year. They might have said yes. And they call this a democracy. It's not a democracy. It's a shambles.
Just quickly to ask, through you, Mr. Chairman, David, how many people in the City of London have lost their jobs as a result of the chaos of the financial crisis from 2008 onwards? How many? And that was the responsibility of the House of Commons? Not one, no. You said people should lose their jobs in Europe because of the euro crisis. I'm asking you what actually happened in this country when the banking crisis was I'll tell you, nobody has lost their job so far. Nobody's been prosecuted.
We gave them 80 billion quid.
Well, exactly. And we're all the sufferers. So, you know, I think this is a pot calling the kettle black, actually.
Right, well, this is going to be the last question, because we're coming up to 9:30, and I want to give our four speakers the opportunity to have the final say in 2 minutes each. And this question is from Neil. He lists a series of measures, and the question is, what role has the EU had in the implementation of them? The measures he lists are the bedroom tax, 20% VAT, large corporations avoiding tax, the ATOS tests for disabled people, oligarchs driving property prices up, and so on. The question is, what role has the EU had in the implementation of them?
I don't think I got all of them, but I don't think the EU has anything to do with any of them. Maybe I've missed one. But the oligarchs buying property has got nothing to do with the EU. What was the first one?
Forced back to work.
What was that?
20% VAT.
20% VAT? No.
Bedroom tax?
Bedroom tax, certainly not. That's UK government, so it's got nothing to do with the EU at all. It's incidentally, it's quite interesting. A lot of people say, oh, well, we have, we can decide on our tax, we decide on our social security, we decide on our education, we decide on our health in this country. It's got nothing to do with the EU. Any of that has got nothing to do with the EU. And a lot of people are pretending that it has, but it hasn't. The main thing that the EU does is help to complete the single market so our businesses can trade and people can have free movement to go and work in other countries and for people to come and work
Very
here.
true.
So really, if people say that health and education and all those issues are covered by the European Union, they are not.
If the questioner is complaining about aspects of national policy, there's something that can be done about this. That's what elections are for. Vote for the government, the MP, to change things. That's democracy, right? But the trouble is that when it goes to Brussels, and I've explained that by every estimate, more than half our laws in total are made in Brussels, then there's nothing you can do about it. That's the point. Democracy is rather like a boxing ring. The politicians slug it out within the ring, and you can back one or the other, and you've got a victor at a general election. But the point about Brussels is that the boxing ring doesn't exist. It's opaque. It's behind the curtain. You don't know who's making the laws. The European Commission has a virtual monopoly on proposing new laws. As we've discussed already, some MEPs have some influence over proposing some minor laws, but the vast bulk of the laws are proposed by the European Commission of bureaucrats who are not elected at all, they're appointed. They're against all monopolies, but they like that monopoly, they like holding on to that one. This is the way Europe operates. So you have an opaque lawmaking system that in any realistic way we cannot influence. So if you don't like the policy, if you don't like what's happening at Brussels level, there's nothing you can do about it. That is the essence of the debate we're having this evening. At national level, you can get rid of the scoundrels and get a new lot in, and it changes. That doesn't happen in Brussels. They never retreat, they never apologise. It's a one-way valve to more legislation.
Okay, folks, we've come to the end of the questions. We're now going to give each of our speakers the opportunity to sum up whatever, in any way they want, with the maximum time of 2 minutes each, please. And we're going in reverse order from how we were at the beginning. So we're starting with Edward McMillan-Scott.
Well, thank you, Chairman. The motion was that this House believes that the European Union is undemocratic and this leads to corruption at the heart of its institutions and politics. Liz and I have sought not only to demonstrate how the EU's democratic process works. It's a fairly tortuous business, but it is fair, and it involves a lot of people, and the eventual result is a consensus across 28 countries, and largely Britain wins, whatever you may hear to the contrary. Now, the opponents, the Leave campaign, and I've already mentioned this notorious programme fronted by Jeremy Paxman, who I think had never been to Brussels before, turns up, tries to paint the European institutions as some sort of ludicrous parody of a democracy process. Actually, in my view, having been there 30 years, it works fairly and it works in your interest as citizens. And I also believe, and especially in recent years, the European Parliament has asserted itself against corruption, against the things that were going wrong, and what we now have is a much cleaner system and one which is there for the benefit of the citizens of Europe. So I strongly urge you to vote to remain in the European Union on the 23rd of June or beforehand if you have a postal vote, and to ignore the siren voices who parody the European Union and don't tell the truth. Thank you.
Archie Hamilton.
Every now and then I wake up in the early hours of the morning with a sort of nightmare, and that is that we have voted by a narrow majority to leave the EU. And the EU comes along and says, oh, we've got some concessions we might make to you. We think you should have another vote. These people don't believe in democracy. They don't believe that people should have referenda. They're absolutely horrified that we're having a referendum in this country because they believe that the people of Europe should never be asked whether they want to stay in Europe or not. They pretend that it's the natural state of countries in Europe being united in the EU. I have to tell you, it is not the natural state of the United Kingdom. We've had a sovereign parliament for hundreds of years, and we should restore the democracy that we have in this country by leaving the EU, and we shouldn't be frightened of the consequences. We must take control back into our own hands.
And now,
Yes, thank you. I think it's been a very interesting debate and generally good-natured. I heard that last week apparently there was nearly some confrontation between some people in the pub and one of the speakers, so I'm very delighted that it hasn't happened tonight. I was hoping for some bodyguard to protect us, but it has been an interesting debate. And I tried to set out in my original remarks of how the European Parliament and the European institutions worked. And I hope that I've given you some flavour of the fact that it's not the unelected bureaucrats who make the decisions, it is elected politicians, MEPs that you vote for. And a lot of people say, oh well, a lot of people don't turn out to vote in the European election. That is not undemocratic. They have their democratic right. It is their choice not to turn out to vote in a European election. If they don't want to vote, then they don't vote. But that's got nothing to do with the system. So in my view, it is democratic, and you can change your MEP regularly the same way as you can change the MPs regularly. So all this nonsense about you can't get rid of people in the European Union, you can get rid of your MEPs, and of course you can get rid of your ministers, because if the government changes, then the ministers change. So David Cameron, if he lost the general election, and another party took over, his ministers wouldn't be representing the UK. The ministers that have been elected to that government would be representing the UK. So I think it's absolute nonsense when people say that you can't get rid of the elected representatives. Of course you can. The European Union, in my view, yes, it's cumbersome, but it is democratic. As Edward was saying, it is a fair system. We need to see some changes. I don't think there's everything right about the European Union. I've never believed that. I've worked for change, as we all have. But there's not everything is right about the Westminster Parliament either, and I've just been given the time. I could go on for hours. But thank you very much for inviting us here.
and David Hepgood.
Thank you. It's no good changing the ministers when the ministers got no power when they get there. It doesn't matter who goes over to Brussels. They might have just. Let's suppose that Cameron loses an election, Labour come in, sends a Labour man over there, or woman, and tries to implement the manifesto on which that party has been elected. He can't do it because he can be outvoted, and I've given you many examples of where that's happened. So the democratic wishes of the British people in changing a government here will have no influence on the laws that are being passed in Brussels. Now, this wasn't always the case. I voted in 1975 in the only other referendum we've had on this. It was called the Common Market. Since then, it's now become unrecognisably different. It's now a proto-state. It's got a legal system, a Supreme Court, a Parliament, an anthem, a flag, a diplomatic service. It has all the makings of a European state. And the 5 Presidents' report, which we haven't referred to, which is their next stage, plans to move to a greater degree of European integration by 2025. That is the next. In other words, by voting to stay in the European Union, you're not voting for status quo, you're voting because we're on a train to an unknown destination. I'm urging you this evening to vote to join the rest of the world. Europe is a backwater. It's a small protectionist part of the world, low growth, high unemployment, pathetic, outrageously high unemployment. I expect most of the people in this room have got jobs. I certainly hope for. Think of the people in Southern Europe whose lives have been wrecked by the European Union. Those are the people we ought to be minding about. It's all very well for you, as it's all right for the technocratic class in Brussels to legislate in this way, but it's profoundly undemocratic. Europe is in decline. Let's vote to join the rest of the world, vote for a free country, vote to leave on the 23rd of June.
Well, I think you'll all agree that we have had 4 absolutely brilliant speakers tonight with very, very different points of view. Can you give them all a round of applause? My thanks to all of you. It's been very good natured. We've had some brilliant questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to ask all the ones that came up, but you have your opportunity again next week and the 2 subsequent Mondays as well. And please keep coming to these debates. Now, we're going to have a vote. We're going to have a vote. And we need to count this very carefully, Ted, because it could be very close this evening. So your clever people behind the bar, I hope will help you. And the motion is as follows. Let me remind you, this House believes the European Union is undemocratic and this leads to corruption at the heart of its institutions and politics. Those in favour, please show. You can vote. Keep them up, please. Keep your hands up, please. Only one hand.
Believe it or not. 21.
21, okay. Those against, please. Sorry?
3. Well, Nicky and I both is 27 or 28. So the motion.
You want to recount? Get it right? Go again, please. There's a discrepancy in the counting.
Hands up. Are you voting against the motion?
Come on. We're taking votes against the motion again because the tellers can't agree.
3, 5, 6, 7, 8. What's going on?
Oh, we got our first time.
I've learned so much more from
It's both Nick and I agree now, 29.
29. Now, when the BBC were here, and I hope you saw our debates on the news, when the BBC were here, they asked me to take a vote of those who haven't made up their minds. I don't think we're going to do that, but what we will do is take a vote for any abstentions. If anybody wants to abstain on this motion, please indicate. No? One abstention. Okay, I declare that the motion is lost by 21 to 29.
So everybody, I'd just like to say a couple of words of thanks, if I may. One to Richard for moderating and acting as chairman, that's been great. And second to my staff, and Chris Benyon, the sound man, who actually puts it all on, but Nikki and Tracy. So they do a great job of serving you. And I guess I can declare the evening closed, apart from the, I think people are going to hang on if they can, and for a few minutes we hope, the speakers. And finally, I'd like to thank the speakers who've come, some from a great deal away, to come here tonight. And what I think has been the very, very, very best debate we've had here. And so thank you very much.